Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Dee Dee Laugesen, Executive Secretary for the Committee on the Present Danger China. We appreciate your interest in our weekly webinars in which we expose and analyze the Chinese Communist Party's unrestricted warfare against America and the help being provided to the CCP in waging that warfare by captured U.S. elites. We encourage you to visit presentdangerchina.org for information on new programs, access to videos of our past webinars, and tons of other very valuable content. And subscribe to our Substack at presentdangerchina.substack.com and follow us on X at CPDChina. For today's webinar, select the Q&A from your navigation bar to make comments or ask questions, and be sure to open up the chat for important links that we will share. Our moderator today is Frank Gaffney. Frank is the president of the Institute for the American Future, vice chair for the Committee on the Present Danger China, and host of Securing America on Real America's Voice Network. Frank, let's get started in 3, 2, 1.
Thank you, Dee Dee. Welcome, everyone, to this edition of our weekly webinar series sponsored by the Committee on the Present Danger China. It is another in a series of recent webinars in which we have tried to focus not simply on the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, but on its agenda, its ambitions in other parts of the world besides Asia, specifically, of late, the Middle East. Of course, in the past few days, we've seen extraordinary developments there, including the use of American military personnel and state-of-the-art equipment to devastate 3 facilities associated with the Iranian regime's nuclear weapons programs. That came on top of ongoing efforts to that point of the Israelis to reduce the capabilities of not just that very ominous program, but also ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, drones, and other kinds of weaponry for delivering ordnance against, among others, Israel. And then we saw the announcement that all of that activity was going to stop, that a ceasefire had been announced, and indeed, according to President Trump, the end of the war achieved, the 12-day war, as he called it. We're going to explore whether, in fact, it is likely, having ended the war without the removal by the Iranian people of the regime that has brutally repressed them for 46 years and done so much harm to Israel and to the United States as well, to say nothing of the harm that they have aspired to do in terms of bringing mass death and destruction to both countries. We are going to be examining whether the circumstances are such now that by allowing the mullahs to remain in place, not finishing the job, not bringing about what I think of as a free Iran, we have provided a windfall for the Chinese Communist Party as well as the Ayatollahs. And to their benefit, yes, but very much to not only our detriment, but that of our friends and allies in the Middle East and perhaps far beyond. And to the extent that that is so, what are the implications? What are the implications, most especially for the ambitions of the Chinese communists to achieve their own aggressive acts and the benefits thereof, perhaps in taking at last Taiwan or doing harm to other allies and interests of the United States in the Western Pacific. We will have with us a very impressive company of men who have studied these matters closely, both from the perspective of what has been taking place in the Middle East for many years, for generations, in fact, but also what it portends for China and China's ambitions and our vital interests more broadly. I'm very pleased to say, as we have done on a number of occasions in the recent months, we have with us by video one of, I think, our country's preeminent Middle East experts. His name is Dr. David Wormser. He is a man who has served at high levels of the government, working at the State Department with an Undersecretary of State, in the National Security Council with its National Security Advisor, and in the Office of the Vice President, where he served as a Middle East expert. He has been a naval intelligence officer as well, and currently is with the Center for Security Policy, where he directs its Mideast programs. We are always excited to have David Wormser with us because of his insights and his recommendations, and we look forward to taking them in board in connection with what we've proposed be his topic. Is the so-called 12-day war actually ended? And if not, what role will the CCP play in the next phase of an endless war? Let's go to Dr. Wormser now.
Thank you, Frank. It's quite an honor and a pleasure to be with everybody. I'm now in Jerusalem. Now it's a quiet city. Thank God, after a week and 2 weeks of a lot of missiles. At any rate, where are we and how does this connect with the larger global strategic situation? Well, obviously, one of the big events over the last few days was the ceasefire, and it is basically holding, but it is a very fragile ceasefire. The Yemenis are continuing to fire missiles. Obviously, that can't be solved without Iran stopping them. And here we are. And the first problem with the ceasefire, which is that the proxies of Iran continue to act, ultimately can only be shut down if you deal with the head of the snake. But right now, there's a ceasefire with the head of the snake. So the tentacles proceed to fight. The head of the snake does not. The second thing is there's been a few little Iranian violations in terms of drones toward the north. But really what's the most concerning part of this ceasefire is the fact that now we're getting reports in all over the place that the Iranians are crawling all over Natanz trying to retrieve the nuclear material that is there. They're doing the same at Fordo. And this really cuts at the problem here. This is a problem that has been dealt with very heavily. And I think the Israelis have done a very thorough job. And then the United States action really brought home the bacon, so essentially, on shutting down the nuclear program now. But the regime is in place. Remnants are there. There's still some scientists around. There's know-how. So Iran is working to reconstitute its nuclear program already now. That is why even before it is digging through rubble to find its leadership or its operatives, the IRGC operatives, it is already prioritizing trying to resurrect its nuclear program. So now we're headed to a situation where President Trump is going to give them again an attempt to now negotiate their way out of a nuclear program, specifically the enrichment. But to me, it seems unlikely that Iran will give in, which means this ceasefire most likely does not have great longevity, and we may in a few weeks be back to where we were. Now, where does this get very worrisome is during the war, the Israelis were degrading the Iranian structures, all of them. They were degrading the nuclear program, they were degrading the missile program, they were degrading the regime's command and control, they were degrading the regime's leadership. And what is happening now is all that is being repaired, it is being worked around, and most disturbing, Iran has access to the outside world. It has access specifically to China. And if one notes, during the declaration of the ceasefire, President Trump did note that now China can trade oil with Iran. This is disturbing because that's money. That's resources that the Iranian regime desperately needs right now to rebuild. We know from past, and we already are seeing it with the prioritization of salvage being given to the nuclear program. We can imagine that the parallel activity will happen with money. Money will surge for Iran to rebuild its proxy network, its nuclear program, and its missiles. So that's disturbing. The second thing is we're hearing reports, unclear how accurate they are, but it seems to have some legs because they're coming from more or less more dependable sources, that the United States is also now adding incentives to Iran to give up its nuclear program, which would be, again, some form of money. One number put out was $30 billion. Again, this would have to be verified, but if so, it is dangerous because the problem is not the nuclear program. In fact, I don't even think the problem is the missile program. I think the problem is that Iran in current constitution is a major element in the larger Russian and Chinese network of nations that is trying to straddle the Eurasian continent and trying to penetrate into the Fertile Crescent to the Mediterranean. And as long as this regime survives, and I think there is a real shot for throwing this regime so far back on its hind legs that the Iranian people really have an opportunity, the first time, perhaps in a generation or two, to take matters into their own hands and to take back their country. Unfortunately, all this deal-making, this ceasefire, is convincing the Iranian people that they are the pawn and they will be sacrificed for the larger goal of a larger deal. This is unfortunate because really Iran, the more this war went on, became very clear this is the linchpin between the two great competing geopolitical blocs. We all knew about the supply and the arsenal that Iran had become essentially for the Russian military campaign in Ukraine. So that's one thing. And the Israelis, of course, did grave damage to that industrial structure. So this helps Europe quite a bit, but it's only temporary. What's more important is that the Chinese look at the landmass of Iran as a critical element, first of all, to create a much more solid Belt and Road structure, which is really, in this case, the Silk Road structure that attaches to Iran, which is the critical end of the Silk Road, and then goes to the Fertile Crescent. So it really makes whether Iran falls and goes to the west, determines whether the entire sort of axis or the fulcrum of the Middle East is turning and weighting toward the Indian Abraham Accords, Israel, Greece, the whole belt of nations that we loosely call the IMEC structure, the India Middle East corridor structure, or whether it turns the other way and it has really a huge buy-in to the Belt and Road structure, which is the Chinese strategic, hard to say how to describe it, the Chinese strategic campaign to bring large land masses into their orientation. And it also links up with the Russians, who have this north-south corridor that they keep talking about, that they hope will link up with Pakistan on south. So we really do have a large geostrategic play here. I really see the Iranians' survival is really a question of large geostrategy. If they survive, we've essentially given an assist to the Chinese and Russians. If they do not, I think we have dealt a grave blow to the Chinese-Russian geopolitical structure that they're trying to create. So that's sort of the larger geostrategic question. in the region also, we have a situation where all the nations of the region are hedging. They're hedging because they're just not sure whether Israel, India, United States will prevail, and it's safe to throw in 100% behind that alliance, or whether they still need to hedge. And that's another geostrategic asset for China in this situation. China is making the point that they're out there. For your own sake, China can deliver the danger or can deliver some protection from the danger of Iran, from the danger even of Turkey, because Turkey is slowly easing itself into this Chinese bloc as well. So China becomes the power broker to guarantee security for countries in the region who are very nervous about the American structure, the American-based structure providing security. Great deal of confidence was built around Israel, but then the ceasefire was rapidly concluded, and I think it has a negative impact on Saudi Arabia and others. So my sense is they will still continue to hedge, and they will continue to hedge with China, because China can't protect them directly, but China can weigh in with Iran and keep Iran from acting against them. So to some extent, this has made China more powerful. As with the Ukraine war, China emerges from this conflict somewhat strengthened, not because of the conflict itself. That was a devastating blow and almost a fatal blow to Chinese influence in the region, because if Iran had gone down, the regime had gone down, it would have been a devastating, catastrophic blow for Chinese strategic interests. But now you have a weak, limping, desperate Iran trying to resurrect, will not give in, will not surrender its nuclear program, and will not geopolitically either shift or calm down. So as a result, it has one address now to go to, which is China, and it will insert itself under Chinese umbrella and nurturing much more as a result, not of the war, but as an inconclusive ceasefire that left them in power. So at any rate, I think at this point we need to just depart from some of the nitty gritty and the trees, and we need to look at the forest and how China is emerging from this conflict strengthened, largely because of missteps at the end of the war. Well, I'll leave it at that, and I've already gone on probably a bit too long, but thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wormser. Always, your length is a function of the amount of incredibly important content you provide, and we're grateful to you for doing so. We're going to drill down further on one aspect of that geostrategic relationship between the Chinese and the Iranians, the energy portfolio. This is something that has clearly gained prominence with President Trump's pronouncement that the Chinese essentially no longer need to smuggle their cut rate oil out of Iran. They can do it above board and thereby make no secret of profiting the Iranian mullahs in exchange for those exports. We turn, as we often do for matters having to do with energy security, to Dave Walsh, leader in the course of his distinguished career in the private sector of Mitsubishi Power and Westinghouse operations. He is these days with the Dakota Group, a consulting group in the energy space, and a very, very prolific contributor to the public policy debate about so many of these energy security issues. But we wanted to get in particular his thoughts about what this tie that binds, if you will mean in the aftermath of this ceasefire for the relationship between China and Iran, for the, cash flow that it assures the mullahs, and the strategic advantages that it provides to the Chinese as well. Dave Walsh, thank you so much for taking some time with us and for your incredible expertise on all of these topics. We are anxious to hear what you have to say. Over to you, sir.
Frank, thanks for having me. I'd like just start by supporting David's commentary on many of us had thought the strike was prudent, appropriate, and made sense given the opportunity presented, not because of falling in love with Netanyahu, not because we want to be involved in a forever war, but the opportunity presented by an emaciated Iran who has slaughtered hundreds, if not thousands, of U.S. troops through its proxy states over the last 20 years to do something about the enriched uranium and nuclear capacity that they have had, hopefully. The whole linchpin of that strategically would be about China and the fact that China had just 2.5 years ago established Iran as an incredibly important geographic forward proxy state in the middle of the Middle East, and one who is consistently, by its own announcements and activities, very hostile, obviously, to the U.S., to Israel for sure. But so the upshot of this incisive strike should have been, in strategy, we hoped it was, about China, which is one of the two devastations of the Ukraine war, Biden's policies vis-a-vis supporting Ukraine so heavily. The two major issues that have arisen for us negatively from that, of course, beyond the money, beyond the $250 billion, the alliance of Russia and China being number one, but secondly, the fact of, in the middle of that, China forging a very strong alliance with Iran as a forward state, surrounding a 2 million barrel a day oil import quota to China, which amounts to nearly $100 million per day of inflows to the Iranian government to support activities like the Houthis, like Hezbollah. And also in exchange for, they have to buy that in renminbi, they're receiving lots and lots of military hardware and support from China inside of that agreement, only forged 2 years and 2 months ago by Xi Jinping and his folks with them. So that there was the nub of a strategic rationale to do this. Now, announcements post-strike appear to be all about cementing the relationship between China and Iran. So a little bit puzzling, to a lot puzzling. The oil deal there is Brent crude pricing minus 40%. So here again, Russia and China specifically have kneecapped OPEC. They've taken strident actions to kneecap OPEC, something we've never done out of homage to the royal family in the kingdom. They've done this. So, you would think perhaps at least in this discourse about coming out of this, if we're going to encourage more oil trade with China between Iran, which we seem now to be doing suddenly in the last 2 days, well, let's at least benefit here from Brent crude minus 40% to help soften oil prices further. The Brent crude number, pricing is not really a relevant number because 45% of the oil in the world is now traded way, way below that because of the Russians and the Chinese actions to kneecap OPEC. One, Russians' exportation to Turkey, to India, to China, well below $60 a barrel, $55, $52 a barrel. Europe's own supposed boycott against Russia, that all that has been as a cap at not being able to buy over $60 a barrel. Time has proven plenty of Russian oil continues to flow into Western Europe at prices sub the cap level. So you've got close to probably something with India's purchases included, close to 40% of world oil trade occurring way, way below Brent crude levels, so they're not really sustainable, but for the presence of OPEC helping to bolster up a market for the West, for Western Europe, and to the extent we buy nominal amounts of it from them still. Certain grades we don't have. There's always going to be an oil trade at high levels, higher than sustainable levels. So the fact that's one of the huge nubs of value in this for China. The 2 million barrels a day is sourceable elsewhere, was coming from Africa before. Now from here, it was coming in terms of oil and LNG shipments that they've pretty much shut off from here, the Chinese, but at 40% discounts from Brent crude. So this was the opportunity presented by this strike. A number of us thought and hoped to strategically show China we're willing to move forward where they develop an advanced proxy state with military capacity that is completely hostile to the U.S. over time. And here it now has turned out in the last 3 days, that's really had nothing to do with the strategy of doing this. So it is a little bit disappointing because in the longer run, the bigger issue for us in this play is not the needs of Netanyahu, but what China has done cementing a energy and economic. There's also active discussions of 2 pipelines for natural gas from eastern Iran into China, which would solve China's big need for pipeline natural gas, which is way more cost effective than LNG, which they have a shortfall of within China. China doesn't really have fungible natural gas available in country. So the pipeline discussions with Russia and now with Iran that will certainly now continue and actually kind of encouraged by us will be further emboldening their now a supply chain for natural gas, which will be cemented and cause them to need no LNG coming from here. Because pipeline gas is $5 to $6 a decatherm cheaper, especially coming from as nearby as eastern Iran. So, yeah, there's a number of consequences of the last few days' dialogue on outcomes of this. Quite disappointing in terms of the signal that could have been sent to China for what this meant in a forward proxy state being damaged when it's hostile to us. Our willingness to do that, not to create a forever war, but our willingness to do it and keep a sustainable threat alive on Iran that should they continue to work on this nuclear program, that we're likely to do the same thing all over again. There's no military interest or strategic interest in announcing ahead of time that you'll never do that. There's no upside in that. And it just isn't one to make a preemptive announcement of we won't use our military might to stop that. And I think a lot of folks, including very conservative ones, have come out and basically wanted that kind of iteration ahead of time. That there's no strategic value in saying things like that in advance. So we're heading in what appears to be a negative direction versus the opportunity we had to send China a message here. And while we're anxiously creating a trade deal with them that looks like was also in the middle of, we didn't want to damage that discussion. So let's not disturb China with any bellicose commentary following this strike. In fact, let's encourage them to trade as vigorously with Iran as they were before. So somewhat disappointing.
Fascinating analysis, Dave, on so many different levels. If you'll stick around, we've got some questions we'd love to tackle with you in a few minutes. We're going to turn next to one of our prominent members of the Committee on the Present Danger, China, a man whose service in the uniform of the United States Marine Corps, as well as a foreign service officer, and also his life experience in business in the Far East, has made him a real utility infielder in terms of understanding both what the Chinese are up to and the implications of events like those we're discussing today for the threat we face from the Chinese Communist Party. He's the author of a book entitled When China Attacks, a Warning to the West. He is also associated with the Center for Security Policy as a senior fellow there, and is a prominent fixture now, I think, in both my own program, Securing America, but also so many others, because of his expertise in all of these areas. His name is Colonel Grant Newsom, United States Marine Corps retired. And we've asked the Colonel to talk about whether the enabling of more endless war in the Middle East will translate into a shooting war in the Pacific. He's joining us by video as well. Let's go to that now.
One thing that really strikes me is that there's a tendency to package this latest operation as a nice sort of wrapping of a bow on a problem with Iran. And, we got a 12-day war and problem solved. Now we're going to talk. The Iranians are going to roll over And, well, we're taking care of that. We're the great peacemakers. I'm not so sure. Mr. Trump is the president, not me. And that matters. But if he asked me, I would have told him I think he stopped it a little too soon. We've seen this before. You remember George Bush stopping the Iraq war when he had the Iraqis on the run. Saddam Hussein had the plane on the tarmac actually sort of fired up, ready to leave. Another 24, 48 hours, and you would have brought down that regime. Instead, he tied it up, ended it prematurely with a 72-hour war. Sounded great. And the excuse they used was, well, that's all we were authorized to do by the UN resolutions, was to get Iraq out of Kuwait. That's all we could do. Well, no, you could have done a lot more than that. So everything that has come of that, think of it, Al-Qaeda, Afghanistan, Iraq, thank you very much. That's what comes of trying to get out on the cheap. A little more effort would have saved us God knows how much heartache, and really put America in a position where I'm not so sure that our position, our prospects are as bright as they otherwise would have been. And that's just one example. George W. Bush did something similar with Iraq. You save. There's that old commercial: you can pay me now or you can pay me later. And that's what we did. We tried to get out of this on the cheap, tried to look good, but keep in mind the nature of that Persian regime, the Iranian regime. These are the guys that tortured CIA station chief Bill Buckley, videotaped it, and sent the videos back to the Americans. They have not changed. That is who they are. And there's no talking these people out of things. There's no deal to offer them. I think they just pulled back too fast. They should have hit every Revolutionary Guard target in the country for as long as it took to humiliate these people, to finish them off. In this part of the world, unless you have your opponent roasting over a spit, don't think you've won. By our standards, we might have, and if someone did that to us, we probably would, but not there. So what I'm afraid we're going to see is the Iranians dig in their heels, maybe say a few things that sound good, keep us on the hook, and then after some period of time of this sort of stalemate, that they're going to say, look, the Americans did everything to us, and the Israelis too. They hit us this hard, they blew us up, and look, we're still here, we're still in power. And that is going to resonate, unfortunately, in the region and beyond. So, but once again, President Trump is the president, and I don't have access to the information he has. But there is some empirical evidence of how things work in this region, of how we have done things in the past, and you can kind of extrapolate from there. So I hope we didn't end it too soon. But if we get sucked into more endless wars, or really any wars in the Middle East, it's going to make conflict in the Asia Pacific more likely. America only has so many resources, so many ships, aircraft to deploy. It's a lot less than it was in the early 80s, and a lot of us who were around then remember how well we handled things there. And the rest of the world forget that our Navy was at least twice as big as it is now. So we just don't have the stuff. We are stretched. I don't think we are able to handle two major theater wars at once. Additionally, there's something about political bandwidth, which an administration can only handle so many troubles at once. It's just the reality. You'd think they'd be able to just deploy people as necessary and get things organized, but they really can't. One big fight somewhere seems to be enough to sort of just distract an administration and make them unable to respond to anything else. And you saw this actually earlier during the GWAT, the Global War on Terrorism, when from 2000 onward, Asia got no attention, almost none. And you would think that, we still had enough forces out there, we would do what was necessary, but no, you had to be there to see it. And this was like a tertiary theater. Out in Asia, nobody cared. Nobody even wanted to pay attention to it, except a few dedicated people who knew what was coming and tried to do something about it. So if we get stuck into a fight in the Middle East, I think it does make a shooting war more likely in Asia, because China can do the math as well as anyone. And they know, well, PLA has this many ships, and we have this many missiles, and we can hit these areas. And America has what? Well, not as much as us. And then they look at America's allies and they see, well, they don't have a whole lot either, and they're not able to operate them in coordination with the Americans. So we like our odds, particularly if we choose our targets and move accordingly. China's objectives in the Asia-Pacific have not changed one bit based on what's happened in the last few weeks in the Middle East. They still fully intend to take Taiwan. They intend to dominate the Western Pacific. They intend to push the Americans out of Asia, out of the Pacific, all the way back to the mainland. If they're feeling magnanimous, they might let us stick around in Hawaii a bit. But that's their objective, and that has not changed. And you're seeing, actually, and this is something that I've heard mentioned recently, is that, well, because of China's economic problems, their military capabilities are lagging as well. But if you look at this over the years, China has always devoted resources to the PLA, far beyond whatever the civilian population or civilian sector gets. Always do that, even when the economy is bad. So the PLA has all the money it needs to say, buy Australian iron ore, to make steel, to build a navy. And you look at their navy, what has recently conducted carrier operations out in the Pacific, as farther east than they've ever gone. And I think they went through U.S. territory, actually, went through the EEZ of Northern Marianas. And that is U.S. territory. They were in Japanese territory as well, really thumbing their nose at everyone. And to conduct these operations shows a level of advancement that one should not discount. And that trend line has continued for the Chinese. So their objectives are the same, and they will apply the resources. And if they see the equation as being in their favor, particularly if America gets dragged into wars in the Middle East, and I'm not saying that America should pull out and just ignore the territory, that area, and leave it to the Europeans, which would be the same as leaving it to nobody. But rather, we have to make sure that we've either got the resources or we deploy them accordingly. It would be nice if we were to pressure the Chinese economically so that even if they wanted to, they wouldn't have much to prioritize for the military. And keep in mind that China's still a country where 600 million people at least live on $5 a day. Most of them don't have flush toilets, or an awful lot of them don't. There are some who do. And that gives you some sense that when it comes to guns or butter with the Chinese, it's always guns. So Asia Pacific is, I would say, no less or no more dangerous than it's ever been. But if we do get sucked into a fight, then you can stand by and expect to see some sort of a move in the Asia Pacific, particularly against Taiwan, Japan, the Philippines as well.
Colonel Newsom, an extraordinarily sobering depiction of the problem, both in the Middle East and in the East Asia theater. And you've tied brilliantly together the two, and we appreciate that extraordinarily. We're going to conclude the program with a final presentation by another of our great contributors to the work of our Institute for the American Future, sponsor of the Committee on the Present Danger China, but also the Victory Coalition. Daniel Greenfield is his name. He has been a driving force behind the David Horowitz Freedom Center for years now, and is the successor to David Horowitz, blessed memory, alas, who is, I think, going to become an even more formidable public intellectual and leader on all of the sorts of issues that we're discussing today. We were able to catch him very late to participate in this program, and as always, I'm so appreciative that he has done so without a lot of preparation or forewarning. But he will, of course, bring this tremendous intellect and deep knowledge of all of these subjects to bear in answering the question that we've put to him, which is the way ahead. What is to be done now vis-a-vis Iran and communist China? Daniel, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Frank. This is a very impressive gathering of experts, and I'm afraid that I can only add so much to that. But to at least sum up some of what we discussed. During this conflict, we had the opportunity, a very perhaps once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, to isolate communist China from its energy supply, and in the process, break up some of what some of the people who have been here, who have been discussing this, David, Dave, others have been discussing in terms of the alliance between China and Iran, and at the same time really isolate China, because the great challenge has been that China has been trying to work around to build its own world power network, economically, politically, in other ways, and in the process isolate us. Now, that opportunity was unfortunately squandered from the same reason that it tends to be squandered in past history, is that we have the sense that we can apply some military pressure and move on to a diplomatic solution without fundamentally realizing, particularly in the case of Iran, Islamic terrorists, that diplomacy there is absolutely a dead end. And we are hearing these now proposals for a grand deal with Iran that will move Iran over into our camp. And this was the sort of thing that had been tried with varying degrees of success elsewhere in the Middle East, with Egypt, for example. But Egypt was, at least by the standards of the region, a more secular government. It was a military government, and one that was willing to be pragmatic and not as ideologically driven. That's certainly not the case with Iran, which is fanatically ideologically driven, whose whole impetus is this conviction of an eventual Islamic victory. The sense that their conflicts are with us are tests of faith, which means that predictably Iran is celebrating a victory. Predictably enough, it's not backing down in any way. And also predictably, it's undergone seemingly the worst disaster it's ever experienced, which to us, a lot of people, seems like an astounding victory for us and a massive defeat for Iran. But from their perspective, they've sustained the worst that we can dole out, the worst that Israel can dole out. They're still here. Their damage to them is something that they can rebuild. How much damage has been sustained by the nuclear program, the rebuilding process is being debated now. But the bottom line is, from Iran's perspective, they can bounce back from this. And, you know, when life is cheap, when the economy is controlled by the IRGC and other elements of the regime, they don't really have to worry all that much. Will it be a complete setback for a Western nation? Is not so for a totalitarian dictatorship, which is what Iran is. So China is now looking at this in two ways. We've sent kind of a double-sided message to China. On the one hand, we've sent the message that we are not entirely predictable, that we can strike quite unexpectedly, and that's something that certainly China's leadership will be thinking twice about when they look at Taiwan, because they don't exactly know what we're going to do. They've seen that unexpectedly the United States can pivot and launch a surprise attack, and that's a good thing. It's good for deterrence. But on the other hand, China has reaffirmed its general impression of us, which is frankly not unjustifiable, that we're a paper tiger, that we have no real staying power in the conflict. And that's really been the bet of every anti-American force, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in Afghanistan, whether it's in Asia, that's come up against us. Their sense is that we have a great deal of firepower. We have ability to cause catastrophic damage. We can, in theory, destroy much of the world. We don't have the morale, we don't have the strength of will to actually move forward with anything. And obviously, this was the calculation, for example, of Hitler, who assumed that we would not be inside the war until 1980. And he was obviously catastrophically wrong. It was the calculation of the Japanese. And we are, at least internally, still the nation that is capable of doing those things in theory. But that is how our enemies tend to see us. And China's impression of us now is that, yes, we're capable of carrying out, in theory, a devastating strike, but we don't really have the staying power for an extended conflict, and they do. No other nation in the world, including China, really thinks that they're stronger than we are. What they believe is that they have a stronger morale, a stronger will than we do. And when we engage in half measures, when we miss opportunities, when we behave in the way that we just behaved, when we start offering up deals, as a practical matter, we are affirming the impression that they should not take us seriously. So how do we move forward? First of all this talk of a grandiose regional deal of an attempt to subsidize China's so-called civilian nuclear program is absolutely a terrible idea. The message that we're sending to China, first of all, is that we are still going to resort to trying to bribe our way out of problems. And that's not the way to impress anybody. Secondly, trying to offer China a civilian nuclear program is a farce, because, offer Iran a civilian nuclear program is a farce. Iran's electrical rates are a fraction of what ours are. They get their energy from their massive energy reserves. They don't need nuclear power in order to have a civilian program. Their only purpose for a civilian program is to weaponize it. So if they accept any deal with us, it will be, again, to advance a military, not a civilian nuclear program. And doing that with them is not going to swing Iran over to our camp. Regime change might have made that possible. Any kind of regime change even might have made that possible. But leaving the same infrastructure and power, whether the supreme leader is officially in power or not, as long as the RGC runs things, it is going to be a government that is fundamentally hostile to us, that will negotiate with us, that will make deals with us only to advance their agendas in the short term, which means we cannot go down that road again. Now, before all this happened, before this conflict happened, I said we should have two policies on Iran. Either we deal with Iran seriously, or we do not deal with them in any way at all, because half measures are a disaster to our perception as a great power. If we engage in half measures, if we show that we can be manipulated, if we show that what we really want is to make some sort of deal, well, we're not going to get a deal. It's fine to hold out our hands to Europe, to Western nations, nations that we have at least some commonality with, nations that are not inalterably hostile to us. With Iran, we really cannot have any negotiations. We cannot have any meaningful understandings except a balance of power. And on the one hand, we've kind of affirmed the balance of power. On the other hand, once we start offering Iran treats and trying to offer them a deal, we go backward. We undo all the good that we did. We can have a balance of terror with Iran because Iran has a balance of terror with us. And as far as Iran's relationship with China, we should continue to try to isolate China. That said, we should continue to isolate China by building bonds and relationships with countries that are not going to be fundamentally hostile to us. Trying to bring countries that are terrorist in nature into our camp is not going to work. It's actually only going to give our enemies a foothold inside our camp. What we can do is try to economically weaken those countries. If we're not going after them militarily, we can weaken them, and we can actually take the entire question of Iran's oil supply to China seriously. President Trump's statement arguably affirmed what has been already, unfortunately, America's policy toward Iran's oil trade with China, which is what we saw under the Biden administration. The Biden administration simply turned a blind eye to it. President Trump went ahead and said that China can go ahead and continue buying Iranian oil. On the one hand, you can see why this is a mistake. On the other hand, in a way, Trump is taking ownership of this, and you could read that as implicitly suggesting that the United States can then choose to cut off that oil if it wants to. And that's something that the administration should explore. We should explore how we can control those oil sales, how we can limit those oil sales, and how we can take that spigot and turn it on and off, not by trying to engage in diplomacy with Iran. We should still do whatever is possible to weaken that regime. And the Trump administration's pressure on Israel to scale down is a mistake. And, forget a thing about whatever alliances we have or don't have with Israel, whatever relationships we do. Let's look at the way Iran handles the situation. Iran has its proxies, its allies, and they continue launching attacks regardless of whatever negotiations Iran has with that country. The United States could use Israel the same way. It could authorize Israel, it could arm Israel, it could give Israel the freedom to attack, and then disavow responsibility for it. And that's a position of strength, really, instead of scrambling to prevent Israel from intervening. So one would hope that the Trump administration will look at this now and say that if Iran does not get on board with a deal that ends its nuclear program entirely and opens it to inspection, that the United States will once again unleash Israel. That is a position of strength that we can take. We should also do whatever we can to continue to economically and politically weaken Iran while avoiding any the extended diplomatic entanglements. Any deal with Iran should be simple and clear if we choose to make such a deal. If we do not, if we have a continuing extended negotiations process as we did with the original nuclear deal with Iran, that is a dead end. It's a process by which Iran repeatedly manipulates us, puts us to the ringer, gets the maximum concessions that it can get, while actually giving us nothing. That's what we've seen with the Obama nuclear deal. We should not settle for any nuclear deal that is short of total, absolutely verifiable inspection on the ground, surrender all nuclear materials. Anything short of that is a disaster, and we're not going to get that from Iran. We certainly have not done nearly enough damage to Iran. We have not actually implemented regime change. Without that, we're not going to get any nuclear deal worth having, which means we should not humiliate ourselves by jumping through the hoops of actually even negotiating with Iran. What we can do is make very specific ultimatums. As President Trump said, unconditional surrender. Short of unconditional surrender, we can make ultimatums in very specific areas. And if there is no reaction, then we can unleash Israel. We can unleash some of our other allies who, if they actually knew that we were offering them backing all the way, might be willing to engage in certain kinds of, maybe not military, but political and economic sabotage of Iran. Iran, as we've seen, is actually much weaker, and it raises the possibility that China is much weaker than we anticipate. And that's something that has to be worrying China after seeing what happened with Iran. We've built up these enemies as great threats, and they are, as far as we know, great threats. But as it turns out, when we actually take assertive action, some of those threats can be significantly weaker than we anticipate. That's the lesson we should have, and that's the policy we should have going forward. Thank you.
Daniel, thank you. Well, I packed a lot into that and set the stage very nicely for our finishing Q&A. I did want to just make a general observation, if I could, and perhaps either of you might want to comment on it in connection with our line of questioning that comes from it. It seems to me that the countries we're talking about, whether it's Iran, whether it's China, whether it's others in their sort of axis of evil, as it's been called, have highly attuned antenna, if you will, for the correlations of forces. The Chinese, I think, have the term for it, comprehensive national power. And there is a general tendency to respect power. It's true of subsistence cultures generally, that they do. It can be the difference between life and death if you get it wrong. But there's a special kind of contempt, and I think you spoke to this, Daniel, a moment ago, for nations that are powerful, but that don't have the will to use that power. And I think what we've talked about in the course of the program is that the United States sort of improved in that measure of power with the action that was taken. And yet it seems as though what I think all of you have said in various ways is the recalibration to regard us with contempt rather than respect and deference has been increased by our failure to finish the job, or at least allow the Israelis to finish the job. So this brings me to a couple of points that are particularly, I think, important to suss out in the context of our topic today. The civilian nuclear program of Iran, Daniel, as you said, has been purely cover for their nuclear weapons program. David, I think, mentioned that there's seemingly some idea of giving them $30 billion to pursue further or otherwise build out their civilian, quote unquote, civilian nuclear power. David, would you speak to the nature of these programs in the hands of regimes that simply are, in this case, have neither an actual economic interest nor any particular technological need for such a program, and the advisability of pouring any amount of money, $30 billion most especially, into that program in Iran under these circumstances?
Well, it's awfully rich in the middle of a budget crisis here, where we're facing $2 trillion per year plus annual deficits, to be now talking suddenly about funding an Iranian commercial nuclear program. This is an oil-rich nation. President Trump pointed that out in spades only 8 days ago. He's exactly right. They have no reason to be pursuing, and actually no strategic interest in pursuing a commercial nuclear program, except for the ability that creates to use the fuel and enrich it further for weapons-grade plutonium. That's the why they would do that. They're awash in oil, and so awash in oil that to sell it at 40% off of Brent crude to the Chinese proves that. I mean, they were producing in excess of 4 million barrels a day before the sanctions that President Trump extracted on them, and so it's ludicrous to think that they would have any interest in a commercial nuclear program that isn't only all about enriching uranium further and causing a reservoir of that to exist for them, a pipeline of it to have nuclear weapons. So I mean, it's a slam dunk on that topic, very clearly.
Daniel, any thoughts on the nuclear program?
No, it's obviously absurd. It's obviously absurd for us to be funding Iran's civilian nuclear program, because there isn't such thing as a civilian nuclear program. And worse still, when we pretend that there is one, we are, giving our enemies two choices of how to see that. Either we are so stupid that we actually believe that they have a civilian nuclear program, or two, we are so afraid of them that we're willing to pretend that they have a civilian nuclear program. And President Trump's strength has been his bluntness in the past. When we actually start to either accept those lies, then we're demonstrating that we are either cowards or idiots. And President Trump's blunt talk is our strength. This kind of perception is our weakness.
Amen. I wanted to ask, in connection with Qatar, I think you were alluding to, the operations of that country. I have a theory, and I just bounced it off of you guys, that the so-called attack on Qatar by the Iranians after the strike was less about any kind of retaliation, because you don't telegraph your punch and you don't aim it at places that aren't likely to cause any damage. If you are interested in actually retaliating, but rather that this was just sort of an opportunity to reboot somewhat Qatar's very obvious and I think, in fact, public affinity for Iran and support for that regime over the years, so as to, enable it to be kind of a broker of the deal that is now known as the ceasefire deal. Any thoughts about that, and more generally, the role that Qatar comes out of all of this playing, and its implications for peace in the region and vis-a-vis the endless war, and that's what it is, against what I think of as Sharia supremacism?
Well, Qatar has been playing the arsonist firefighter in the region for quite some time, unfortunately. As a result, this is just part of their pattern. They set off conflicts, they set off terrorist attacks, and then they step in to manage them. And it gives them a great deal of soft power when they can step in and say, we will resolve this conflict. We will be the honest brokers. You can't talk directly to the terrorists. We can do it for you because we have control over them. And it's an incredible ability to assert power over us, because Qatar is able to wield the power of everybody from Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, in this case, Iran, the Houthis, against us. It forces us to come to them and ask them for help. And in the process, they are able to play this game where they wield influence over us and they dictate the terrorist demand to us. And that's an unacceptable state of affairs. Qatar is, as far as its actual strength goes, it's absurdly weak. There's nothing there. It's a small population. It's a slave state. It gets a whole lot of power from its money, and it's used that money to wield power over us, and at the same time to build up terrorist networks that attack us. So this is a cycle that we need to break, and the entire situation where Qataris come in and they negotiate a deal where Iran strikes at us supposedly, but it's not a real strike, and Qatar then gets to dictate the terms of the settlement for the war that they started, while at the same time we try to look like it's a victory when in actuality it largely benefits Qatar. It's a situation that absolutely cannot continue. It's practically unprecedented in modern political affairs, and we should put an end to it as soon as possible.
Amen. And David, somebody told me, and I think it might have been in the course of this program, that the Iranians own 60% of the gas fields, I guess, in Qatar. Could that possibly be true? And how would you characterize, on the energy side of the ledger, the relationship between these two powers?
They are heavily involved with Qataris in co-ownership of gas fields. I'm not as sure of the 60% number. But we all should recall Qatar is head on head with us in and out the number one supplier of LNG in the world. That's a major important topic to this country. Now our second largest export commodity across our $2 trillion of exports. We still have a $1 trillion trade deficit, although it's improved in the last 3 months quite a bit. The LNG exports for us are incredibly important. The Qataris are head on head our number one competitor globally. We should be taking policy actions and influence that convince Japan, convince Western Europe, convince our allies that Qatar is not a safe, reliable source of natural gas on an LNG basis. We are, as opposed to kind of cooperating with them on agendas that, as Daniel pointed out, are hostile to us in the longer run and manipulative ones.
Big time. I think, Daniel, you alluded to this, and I just wanted to tease it out a little further in terms of concessions that we've been making to the Chinese of late. We've touched upon the oil purchases from Iran several times now, but in addition, just in the past 24 hours, I believe the administration has made it known that in exchange for somewhat improved access to rare earth minerals from China, and I assume magnets as well, we are prepared to relax restrictions on their access to chips. We've also apparently forsworn any limitation on Chinese students in the United States, or maybe not any, but certainly their participation in our educational systems on a large scale. Would you comment on the strategic, implications of those sorts of concessions?
This is kind of the pattern of the problem we're seeing with the Trump administration. Unlike past administrations, President Trump is aggressive in these negotiations. He takes things that everybody before and the American administrations in China took for granted, like the access for Chinese students, and he takes that hostage, so to speak, and makes that a negotiating point, which is great. Nobody in the past has even bothered to really do that. The minus side of that is that negotiations are very incremental. They're meant to achieve certain limited advantages. And once those advantages have been secured, then there's no real thought to the broader, bigger picture of whether we should, substantively cut off China in certain ways for our own national security. It's all about ultimately making these deals. And while it's great that we're at least negotiating, we have not in the past even bothered to negotiate. At the same time, it's catastrophic because we are not thinking substantively of how we want to gain a long-term advantages, how we want to prevent China, for that matter, for gaining advantages over us through some of those methods. So it's a kind of an unserious way of looking at things strategically. It's not a long-term scenario. It's all about these short-term advantages, and these short-term advantages might be substantial economically, but at the same time, even militarily perhaps, but at the same time, we need to think about how we want to win the war long term. And this administration has been somewhat deficient in doing that.
Yeah, that's putting it charitably.
Frank,
yeah.
I would add just rapidly to that, enhanced access to things like lithium and cobalt, specifically that wind up for use in intermittent, massively expensive energy resources over here, are of no value to us. I mean, we're still on the page that electric vehicles are massively too expensive without subsidies. Battery storage backing up Chinese lithium-based solar power that, by the way, the state that I'm in is just about to approve another $6 billion of spending on Chinese solar panels through Florida Power and Light, spending on or expending negotiation resources on making those kinds of materials accessible from China to us that are all about higher energy costs here are senseless. They add no value. Lithium adds no value to our economy when used in energy. It's 9 times more costly than conventional combined cycle American natural gas for power generation. So all this should be considered in pretending to have trade agreements that involve things that we don't really want more of because they're too costly. They're too costly to use to create energy.
Yeah. Well, and David, as you've explained here and elsewhere frequently, there's also a strategic vulnerability to importing those
huge
various technologies, especially since, as you again have helped really describe, is insane, namely that they have various devices in their high voltage transformers, in their inverters, in their panels and their batteries to interrupt their performance, shall we say, or perhaps break them. No,
that's been indisputably proven at the Sandia Labs and in studies the British have done on solar panels coming from China. That's a proven fact. It's not a supposition or speculation. Yeah. That's all real.
And we now have the Energy Secretary. This is a little bit off topic, but since we're into this territory, I would like to just drill down on it with you. The Secretary of Energy is, I think, saying even if none of that applies, none of those bad things that they could do to us kick in, that we're at the point where the grid is likely to break just as a result of the overuse and difficult climactic circumstances, shall we say. Just a quick word on that assessment, sir.
Yeah, we have closed down too many coal plants. We have built now in the last 7 years too few baseload continuous duty coal plants or combined cycle plants. We've built only one nuclear plant, so we've allowed the intermittent part-time energy resource in electrification to grow now to about 18% of U.S. electricity supply. We just had a big brownout in New Orleans because of this at 4 p.m. Typically, when this happens, the sun begins to go down, solar power wanes, and you wind up with shortages. In Duke in North Carolina this week announced, hey, everybody, turn down your use of the washer and dryer from 4 to 8. Turn the AC up from 4 to 8, the temperature up, thermostat up, because they no longer have enough baseload continuous duty power to offer between 4 and 8. Once the sun diminishes, all they've built up there the last 10 years are solar farms in the Carolinas. This is a disaster already. It's the disaster of overusing this expensive and part-time, highly intermittent technology that's hardly advancing very much. It's insane to begin with, let alone depend on China for the importation of it.
Right. I'd like to ask both of you, if you would, to address a final question. This series that our Committee on the Present Danger China has sponsored, and I'm compelled to plug the subscription for it. All of you, I hope, are already subscribed who are listening to us live, but many others would benefit, I think, for sure, from regular notices which we provide that we're doing these webinars each week, and their topics and the people participating and so on. You can learn all about that at presentdangerchina.org. Please become a regular participant in these programs. But coming up right after our national holiday will be a meeting convened in Rio de Janeiro by the so-called BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and a whole gaggle of others now who have not, like the LGBTQI question mark, they don't keep adding letters to their name, fortunately for us. But one of the things they may subtract, if they have their way, is the dollar as the perhaps only reserve currency of the world. There's a lot of skepticism about this, but I wanted to put this in the context of the unrestricted warfare that these programs are trying to document and warn about and urge corrective action be taken concerning. And to put to both of you, how might this BRICS meeting have gone differently if we had successfully and decisively defeated, and by that I mean, to my way of thinking, the Israelis continued to take down the security apparatus of the mullahs and create conditions under which the people of Iran did finally have it within their ability to bring about an end of the regime and hopefully a free Iran. But that is not to be, at least for the present moment, apparently. Would either of you comment on the unrestricted warfare agenda of the Chinese, especially the Russians too, of course, and others, in attacking the dollar in the next 10 days or so? And what might have been, if you'd care to speculate on it, if we had finished the job in Iran.
Just quick, I'll let Dan go. China's the lead sponsor of BRICS. They're in the lead on arranging this. It's all about creating a currency based not just on gold, but on fungible resources the global South needs to forever out-industrialize the West. That includes uranium, yellow cake, coal, oil, natural gas, some lithium inside of the basket of commodities, energy commodities that would form the currency that they're looking at creating. It's not just about gold. Therefore, our ability to yank Iran out of OPEC, not by going in there by force with 4 years worth of men on the ground, but simply not announcing a termination of hostilities prematurely of the type we just visited them with, would have been another major potential death knell in the value of BRICS, which the OPEC nations are in the middle of, and Arabia has not eschewed support for as yet. So would have been incredibly important.
Thank you. Daniel, your thoughts?
Well, as has been previously pointed out, Iran has actually been left more vulnerable, which in some ways makes them more useful to China. Our efforts seemingly to try to negotiate some sort of arrangement with Iran or to bring it over to our camp is doomed, which means that China and the BRICS nations can be pretty confident that they're going to have access to Iran's energy resources. And that obviously is not a setback for them. It's potentially a source of strength for them.
Indeed. Well, gentlemen, thank you. We've reached the end of our time, and I so appreciate your insights and those of our colleagues who were joining by video, David Wormser, of course, and Colonel Grant Newsom. You are all, as far as I'm concerned, preeminent authorities in your respective areas, and the expertise that you've brought to this particular topic is of surpassing importance, I believe, because it may not be over for reasons that I think David talked about and others of you have to varying degrees alluded to. This can't work out. And whether it is something as prosaic as discovering that the Iranians are murdering their own people, much like Saddam Hussein did the Kurds, as I think it was Colonel Newsom had pointed out, or whether it's something rather personal, namely that the Iranian assassination squads in this country who have as their mission killing President Trump might well concentrate the mind about the need, actually, as I said, to finish the job with the help of our Israeli friends. Some have taken to calling the Israelis a protectorate of the United States. I think nothing could be farther from the truth. If anything, I feel as though we may become, or are in the process of being, a protectorate of Israel because it has been doing the work that needs to be done to eliminate a mutual threat. A threat, of course, to the people of Iran, as well as the people of Israel and the people of the United States, and for that matter, Judeo-Christian civilization writ large. I'm prayerful that this will take place sooner rather than later, because I think, as has been indicated by our panelists, time is not on our side. The Iranian, the Chinese, the Russian, the BRICS, the other axes here that are operating and are emboldened by what has been done to declare a war over, when that can only be done as a practical matter if an agreement to end it is not forthcoming, by surrendering. And that is not in the interest of the United States of America, nor, I believe, the free world. So I would leave you with this prayer, that God will, in his Grace, give us a redo opportunity here before too much time passes, with the heavy lifting being done by our friends in Israel, that might better be described as a superpower regionally at the moment, insofar as has been pointed out by one of our other colleagues who is not on this particular program, but was with us last week, I believe, Rabbi Pesach Werlicki. Israel now has air superiority, in fact, air dominance, essentially throughout the region. And that, again, gives our friend Israel the opportunity to help assure that we have a free Iran, not because they dictate it, but because they help create conditions to bring it about with our blessing. I pray all of that will come our way. With that, I will leave you and turn the mic to my friend Didi Logison with my profound thanks for you listening and participating, and hopefully spreading word of this very important webinar to your friends, colleagues, family members, and others. God bless you all.
Thank you, Frank. A video of this webinar will be posted to presentdangerchina.org within a day of our program's conclusion. As Frank said, please share this and our other programs with your elected representatives, colleagues, other networks, and especially your family. For webinar notices, updates, and news, subscribe to our Substack at presentdangerchina.substack.com. Follow us on X at CPDChina. Join us again next week for another installment of our Committee on the Present Danger China webinar series on the CCP's unrestricted warfare against America and the free world, and how the CCP elites betray, CCP captured elites betray the USA. Thanks for joining us today, and goodbye.